Welcome to another video from ExplainingComputers.com. This time we're going to look at 7 different desktop operating systems that are all available for a Raspberry Pi 5, Pi 500 and Pi 500 Plus, as well as the Raspberry Pi 4 and 400. So let's go and get started. In this video, we're going to begin with the most mainstream desktop operating systems for the Pi 4 and Pi 5 computers before progressing to those that are a little bit more specialist or obscure. And so inevitably we're starting here in Raspberry Pi OS, the official operating system from Raspberry Pi themselves. This is an excellent, very well supported and very stable Linux distro which until 2020 was called Armbian. Back when it was first released in 2012, this operating system looked like this. Since then it's come a very long way indeed and is now a great general purpose operating system. In particular, if you want to do programming projects that use GPIO or cameras, in my view Raspberry Pi OS remains by far the best operating system available for the Raspberry Pi. Also in my view, any modern desktop operating system must be able to allow its hardware to stream video in a browser. And so here we're going to check out 1080p YouTube playback in each operating system. And note that in this video I'll be running all of the operating systems on a Pi 5, 500 or 500 Plus, which have the same 2.4 GHz quad-core CPU and Video Core 7 GPU. However, everything also works on the Pi 4 models. So let's test out our video playback. Here is my test video. Let's just maximize that and make sure we're in proper 1080p. We are. We'll bring up stats for nerds, and we had a few drop frames initially as we can see, but basically once it's settled, playback here is absolutely fine. There's no problems playing back 1080p video on a Raspberry Pi 5 running Raspberry Pi OS. So let's call that test done like that, as I now want to point out that here in Raspberry Pi OS, if we go to the menu and to accessories, we find Raspberry Pi Imager, which wants my password, so we will give it to it like that. And this recently updated application makes it very easy indeed to select a new Raspberry Pi operating system. The Imager is also available for Windows, Mac and other Linux distros, and a network version can also be run on a Raspberry Pi by pressing and holding the Shift key on boot if your Pi has a wired Ethernet connection. So it is possible to set up operating systems on a Raspberry Pi without using another computer. And, unless noted otherwise, every operating system included in this video is directly available here in the Imager. It is, however, worth noting that if you want to install the latest version of Raspberry Pi OS, for example on a Raspberry Pi 5 like this, that the default recommended version first shown here does not include recommended applications such as LibreOffice. And so, to install this version with all the applications, you need to go to Raspberry Pi OS Other and then Raspberry Pi OS Full 64-bit. Next, let's move on to Ubuntu, specifically Ubuntu 24.04, which we're running here. Hello, although Ubuntu 26.04 will be along in April 2026. Canonical, the publishers of Ubuntu, have a good track record of providing support for the Raspberry Pi. And although, as we can see if we look at their website right now, only the Pi 4, Pi 400 and Pi 5 regular Pi models are officially certified and supported, I've had no problems running Ubuntu on a Pi 5 and a Pi 500 Plus. And indeed, right now we are running Ubuntu on a Pi 500 Plus, and we're even doing so from a micro SD card, just to prove you don't have to use an SSD to get decent desktop performance on a Raspberry Pi. However, it is worth noting that you need 4 GB of RAM or more to run desktop Ubuntu well, and so it's not best suited to the 1 GB or 2 GB Raspberry Pi 4 or 5 models. This noted for general desktop computing where I'm not working with GPIO or cameras, Ubuntu is now my favourite Raspberry Pi operating system. Why? Well, it simply has a better feel than Raspberry Pi OS, which, if we jump back, looks like this, compared to Ubuntu, which looks like this. Font and interface scaling more generally are also better in Ubuntu, I think, than in Raspberry Pi OS, and I guess it just feels to me a bit more professional using Ubuntu than Raspberry Pi OS. It's just got a better, as I said already, look and feel. It's just a more mature desktop Linux distro. They know what they're doing. Maybe it's just familiarity that means I prefer Ubuntu to Raspberry Pi OS when I'm working on a Pi and I'm not programming things that use GPIO or cameras. We should do the video playback test, and here I have to admit that Raspberry Pi OS works better. Let's just bring up this full screen, make sure we're in 1080p. Always have to check that, and we'll just bring up stats for nerds, but I think we don't need that to prove to us this is not quite as good. Got lots of drop frames there, and even when things have settled, we've still got drop frames. It's not as easy to watch video in Ubuntu on a Pi as it is in Raspberry Pi OS, but it's acceptable. That was quite a smooth transition, but there's no doubt at all Raspberry Pi OS does beat Ubuntu on the video playback stakes. But anyway, I can't even get out of it, can I? There we are, we're back on the desktop in Ubuntu 24.04. Greetings! Next on our list we have this, FydeOS from Fyde Innovations. This is based on Chromium OS, so is very similar to the Chrome OS operating system used on Google Chromebooks. However, you don't have to use a Google account with FydeOS, and indeed, as I've done here, you can install and use it with a local account. FydeOS is very fast and responsive on a Pi4, Pi5 and related Pi models, and is designed for running cloud applications. This said, it's possible to install subsystems for running local Linux or Android software. If you want to install FydeOS, note that it's not included in Raspberry Pi Imager, and so has to be installed by downloading it from the FydeOS website. As we can see here, here is FydeOS for SBC, where we have links for Raspberry Pi 5, 500 and 500 Plus, as well as the Pi 400 and Pi 4. And once you've downloaded your relevant image, you'll need to write it to a microSD card or other media using Etcher or indeed Raspberry Pi Imager. Just like Chrome OS on a Chromebook, we can access applications from a menu here on the left. Here we are, this is what's installed by default, and then we also have a menu here on the right where we can access things like settings. Now, I've already said that I prefer Raspberry Pi OS when working with GPIO or cameras, and Ubuntu for general desktop computing on a Pi. However, FydeOS is, I think, the best operating system if you have a Raspberry Pi connected to a television and are using it lean back with a wireless keyboard and mouse or other remote controllers. In my view, this provides a much better experience than using a smart TV operating system or indeed a dedicated Raspberry Pi Media Center OS such as LibreLec. Media playback in FydeOS is very good, and to prove it, let's do our standard YouTube playback test. Here is our test video. Let's full screen that and make sure we're in 1080p. There we are, and bring up stats for nerds. And as always on the Pi, there's a couple of drop frames at the start as things settle down, but after that, playback is very good. I think it's slightly better than what we see in Raspberry Pi OS, but it certainly isn't any worse. You certainly get very good playback of at least 1080p media content here in FydeOS on a Raspberry Pi. This said, there is one thing to note, which is that if you want to play DRM-protected streaming media services in FydeOS, such as, for example, Netflix or Disney+, then you need to install Google's Widevine DRM technology. But this is very easy to do and very well documented on this FydeOS page that I'll link in the video description. Next, we come to Twister OS, which is an increasingly popular and very polished SBC operating system. although, like FydeOS, it's not included in Raspberry Pi Imager, and so needs to be downloaded from the TwisterOS website, which is very straightforward. Here it is on the site, and although here it doesn't list the Raspberry Pi 500 Plus, do not panic, it works on a Raspberry Pi 500 Plus, which is what we're running on here. One of the key features of TwisterOS is that it provides lots of different interface themes. These are selected using an application that's included on the desktop like that, and as you can see, lots of different themes are available. So for example, if we want things to look like Windows XP, we can select that like that, press enter, and we just have to log in again. Here we go, and we're now themed like Windows XP, which is rather impressive. It's a very nice feature. And if we want to go back, we just return to the application, where I think we'll go back to where we started, the light theme of TwisterOS, its default theme. And I am impressed that unlike in some other distros where you can change themes, when you go back to a theme you've used previously, your settings are restored. Under the hood, TwisterOS is based on Raspberry Pi OS, and so hardly surprisingly offers good streaming media playback. But I will prove it. We'll just launch our browser and go to my standard YouTube test clip. There it is. Let's just full screen that and make sure we're in 1080p. We are, and we'll bring up Stats for Nerds, which we don't really need, as we've got used to. Now we have a few drop frames at the start as things settle on the Pi, but after that, got no problems at all with this streaming media playback. Back on the desktop, as you probably noticed, by default we have an applet for monitoring system performance. Here it is, it's called Commander Pi, although you do have to have good eyesight to read it. And indeed, overall, TwisterOS is not fantastic when it comes to accessibility. However, it has got lots of great things pre-installed, not least it's got Pi apps pre-installed, which allows you to install lots of different Raspberry Pi applications, and in fact it's also got PiKiss pre-installed, another app store for the Raspberry Pi, so we've got lots of means here in this operating system of installing Raspberry Pi software. If we look in the menu, you'll see there's also lots of things pre-installed, lots of accessories here. Under Games, we've got the DOSBox emulator pre-installed, and indeed, if we go down to System, you'll see we've got Wine pre-installed along with various related applications, along with the Box86 and Box64 emulators. And so, if you're a retro gamer, you can rapidly get down to play in TwisterOS. And just to prove the point, let's open up Files, where in Downloads I've got an exe file for PackPC, which you can run in the DOSBox emulator. Here we go, very exciting. We'll just Alt-Enter for full screen. And here we are running one of the greatest arcade games of all time. And if you want more information about using DOSBox to run retro games, things like that, I've got a dedicated video. Next, we've arrived on the friendly angular penguin adorned desktop of Armbian, and specifically Armbian with a very vanilla GNOME desktop pre-installed, as we can see. Armbian describes itself as the universal operating system, and this is because Armbian supports more single-board computers, more ARM, and indeed now RISC-V development boards than we could shake a very large stick at. Armbian is available in Raspberry Pi Imager, although when I installed it this morning, and this is version 25.11.1, it didn't have a browser pre-installed. And there are lots of things pre-installed. There is an FTP client, FileZilla, there is a GIMP, there is a LibreOffice, media players, etc. Lots of things are pre-installed, but there wasn't a browser, and so I had to install Firefox. And it probably therefore doesn't surprise you if we run up Firefox and do our standard media playback test. It is not ideal. Things are not optimized here for playback in Armbian. Let's just full screen our clip. Come on, it's being a bit laggy, isn't it? Come on, you can full screen, do it for us. There we are. And we'll just make sure we're in HD. Are we in HD? We are now. Bring up Stats for Nerds. As previously, we don't need it. We can see there are issues here. Masses and masses of drop frames. It's settled a bit, hasn't it? But it's still not ideal. It's maybe on par with what we saw in Ubuntu. Possibly, possibly not. But I don't think you'd choose Armbian for media playback on a Raspberry Pi. But Armbian has got a great deal of support, a great community, and therefore Armbian has earned its place on this list. Greetings and felicitations of mirthful joy. Why? Well, because we're now running Kali Linux, which is a specialist Linux distro with a fantastic desktop wallpaper. And whilst Kali is not something I personally have much experience of, I know that many consider it to be an important desktop distro for the modern Pi, and so here it is on our list. Specifically, Kali Linux is designed for penetration testing, ethical hacking, and auditing network security. And so, if we go up to the menu, we find loads of pre-installed applications all related to digital forensics. And as we can see, it really is an amazingly large list of such programs, all grouped very sensibly into different kinds of categories. If you want to learn about cybersecurity and related software, then Kali Linux is an excellent place to start. And of course, you can use Kali Linux as a general purpose desktop operating system. And whilst providing a browser optimized for media playback is not its focus, for completeness we will run our test because we've got Firefox waiting for us up here. So here we go. Let's go to our standard test clip and full screen. A little bit of a lag here, but again, not the focus of this distro. There we are. Make sure we're in proper 1080p and bring up stats for nerds. And as I think we can see, we have got some drop frames going on. This is not the worst playback we've seen, but it's not really what Kali Linux is for. This is for people getting into the world of cybersecurity. And so there we are. Kali Linux, a useful tool for helping to keep computers and networks secure and holding hackers at bay. Finally, we've arrived at DietPi, a very resource-efficient operating system that will work well not just on the Pi5 and Pi4, but also on earlier Pi models. The download is a mere 170 megabytes, which, as we can see, is a lot smaller than the image files for the other operating systems we've just looked at. This said, 170 megabytes is the base install to which a desktop and other applications need to be added during first boot if you want a desktop system. The first run process is command line only, pretty extensive, and at the end comes the option to install a desktop and other software. For this review, I selected a lightweight LXDE desktop along with the Firefox web browser. And after some considerable code crunching, this resulted in the setup we're now looking at. Inevitably, indeed intentionally, what we have here is pretty minimal, with not a lot pre-installed. There's a few things here and there, but basically we have a minimal system to which the user can add exactly what they want as required. To help with this, there's a software icon on the desktop, which gets us back to the software installer included during the first boot process. So here we could, for example, browse software like that and add things to the system as desired. Although here I will just come out of this like that, exit, there we are. Do we want to exit? I think we will. And I do like this more minimal type of computing. And indeed, one of the things you get with DietPi is a system that is very responsive running here on a Raspberry Pi 5 because it's got such a low demand on system resources. And in fact, we can see that if we run up HTOP, which is included here on the desktop. And as we can see, we're using about just under 280 megabytes of memory to run this desktop system. A lot less than we generally see being used on a desktop system, even in Linux. Finally here, as you may recall, we did install Firefox. So let's run up the Firefox browser and we can run our YouTube streaming media test. It won't be spectacular on this system, but it will work. Being a little bit laggy, but come on, there we are. We're full screen now. And we'll just go to 1080p and bring up stats for nerds, which as I've been saying all the way through, we know we've got drop frames here. We're bound to have it. It's a little bit jerky, but it does work. And I kind of forgive it because this is a minimal resources distribution. I like DietPi. It gives you another perspective on using a desktop operating system on a Raspberry Pi. So there we are. 7 great desktop operating systems that are all available for the latest Raspberry Pi models. And that last bit is important, as some desktop distros are still not available for the Raspberry Pi 5 and related computers. This said, as we've seen, the choice available now is very good indeed, and I hope this video has given you some ideas about what you might want to run on a Raspberry Pi. But now that's it for another video. If you've enjoyed what you've seen here, please press that like button. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe, and I hope to talk to you again very soon.